The wonderful occasion opportunistically arose because of my chance encounter with Sampada Nanji. Uh, Serendipity is how I kind of really conceived and conceptualized yesterday when I was talking to Sanjeev ji and some wonderful colleagues here. And he has a very fruity description of the origin of the word serendipity. And I'm not sure it's one for the Puritan inclinations of Indian academia, but more for a coffee table conversation. So we'll leave it at that. When we entertain the big questions of life, when we begin to unpack the really big questions of life, it always serves us well to engage in a bit of existential rethink. For one, it allows us, it frees us from our habitual thought processes. It relieves us from a partial, if not patently wrong, worldviews. And this is a painting from the illustrious painter Gauguin, where he reflects on these questions. And I'm reminded of this lecture series by the famous quantum physicist Erwin Schrödinger. He's fine. It's Erwin Schrödinger when he asked to speak about knowledge. He said, it's patently obvious, yet it needs to be stated that the virtue of all intellectual pursuits in narrow disciplines is only valuable insofar as it aids the synthesis of all the comprehensive knowledge that there is. And even then, only insofar as that synthesis serves to answer the demand, who are we? And there's another famous neurosurgeon, Roger Penfield, who said the burden, the problem of neurology is man himself, nothing less. I was talking yesterday, and this conversation about what humanism is arose yesterday itself. And humanism is a very protean concept. It can be contested as well. And if for semantic hygiene, if we confine ourselves to pinning down its theoretical boundaries, we run the risk of being caught up in endless debates. But for a moment, let's kind of really limit our understanding of the term to mean that we are cherishing and celebrating human dignity and the perennial human condition. And if we look at all those quotes added around there, we could be forgiven for wondering that they are speaking in many voices. There is the famous philosopher Sophocles, who exhorts about the virtues and the wonders of humanity. But then there is the rather dismal and dispiriting opinion of Heinrich Himmler, who says that there is nothing particular about man. He is but a part of this world. And I've been recently in the specter of uh, utter wretchedness and pervasive degeneracy because of Israel and Palestine war, and a rather more protracted one in Russia and Ukraine. We are forever really caught up in rapturous wonder about what the possibilities of our life embody, and the kind of despondence that we are beset with in the face of pervasive distress all around. And Emerson, when he was visiting the Natural History Museum, was struck when he was kind of really looking at the tapestry of uh, different specimens, and he could not really stop himself from wondering about the interconnected nature of creation itself and man's embeddedness in the wider creation itself, which is why he said that we are the makers of the latitudes and longitudes of our condition, finding agency and individuality, which is a theme we'll return to when we explore and touch upon singularity in a technological age. So, given this context that's rather dispiriting and dismal, one wonders whether humanism can be the guiding light, the governing logic of directing the course of a collective human enterprise. Which is why, we frame reality and history in terms of lost paradise. The mythical literature is replete with those mentions. Philosophers have wondered about the possibility of realizing idyllic utopia. But the problem is, we are also really wistfully hoping for recapturing the rapture, as it were. Why is it that when we long to be good, we so often find ourselves individually and collectively as a human enterprise teetering off almost in a very opposite direction? So, on the left is Steven Pinker's very much acclaimed popular book. It's somewhat contentious as well, where he espouses about the virtues of enlightenment, of having moved away from an supernatural being underwriting the conception of humanity and its virtues, to positing our conviction in the arbiters of enlightenment movement, of reason, of liberty, of freedom, of technology, nothing less. But yet, if you really look at that, if we look at what is the problem, what prevails currently in the dominant climate, if I look at human wretchedness in the world of finance, so I remember in Oxford, we were taught finance largely from a psychological angle. Does this not really look like something that's divorced from the concrete realizations of our life and of our activity? Which is why we need to really entertain thoughts from a diverse array of different disciplines, invoking the virtues of both metaphysics and technology and science as well. And it's a family quarrel, it's a family quarrel more or less, and which has really done a lot of injustice to a collective pursuit for knowledge. So Alfred North Whitehead said that this family quarrel has really not really served us at all. So this is again a way of orienting ourselves. I think this talk is held under the aegis of Center for Human Sciences. A large part of anthropological discovery and our spiritual orientation lies in how we really orient ourselves to the world and the burdens and the existential dilemmas and burdens it places upon us. So now we really look at where we are from a biological angle. If you see, these are prominent books by certain very renowned primatologists, and they capture a certain version of human propensities. They are not very empowering at first blush, but they are every bit about it is as real. So for instance, Sapolsky has really come out with his recent book called Determined, where he insists that the very conception of free will is a figment of human imagination. What he's suggesting is that when biology, and kind of course, it draws from a very rich tradition of determinism, reductionism and determinism, but he's making a very strong case. He's corroborating his case with very substantive research from the world of biology and neurobiology. So what he's saying is, the idea to conceive of human affairs and human expressions and human pursuits as if there is a separate sense of self that is overriding and directing human ambitions, human activities, is, I believe, largely a misnomer and something that the real world really doesn't bear out with any level of veracity. So, Richard Wrangham has written about demonic males, and if you really look at a bunch of tribal marauding males of primates, and if you look at prehistoric societies and you see some of its recent realizations in the modern world, they bear a remarkable similarity. And the famous social biologist, evolutionary biologist, Robert Leakey, who runs a Leakey Foundation as well, and they've done some amazing work in exploring the origins of humanity itself. He says that it's not enough to realize, it's not sufficient, it's not a truthful representation to realize that in many significant ways we resemble apes. He stretches his assertion. He says in many ways we are apes. So we have a very strong tendency to divide the world in very binary camps, us versus them. And these markers of affiliation are writ large across the human theater. It could be writ large in less insidious ways in the competition instincts that happens since in Harvard goes against Yale or Oxford goes against Cambridge, or maybe Rishi would go on in a sports tournament against O.P. Jindal. In more crude ways, what we are seeing in Israel and Hamas right now. And what is really happening here? What are the neurobiological determinants that kind of really drive this degenerate frenzy of human excesses? So people have really looked at the biological origins, the hormonal influences that play out in these individual and collective behaviors. So not far back, oxytocin was the doyen of spreading warmth and fuzziness all around us. And there were some people who naively went around suggesting that if you just spritz up oxytocin, then there would be a world of bonhomie and warmth spread all around, because it's a bonding hormone. It kind of promotes mother-infant bonding, pair bonding in couples, and parent-child bonding. So is it possible that an excess overdose, almost a pharmaceutical instrument to spread humanism across vast swathes of humans? It turns out, as it invariably turns out, when you really probe things a little deeper, that reality is a lot more different and a lot more nuanced than that. So it was found out in subsequent explorations that oxytocin does increase that sense of warm, fuzzy afterglow of bonding, but only in people you identify as us. In people you identify as them, it promotes almost an antithetical behavior of hostility. So they did an experiment in Netherlands with Dutch university students. They invoked the classical philosophy, the runaway trolley problem, where the problem for those who are not conversant with that, it involves, again, it draws from the conceptions of kind of reductionism, of how to really assess the collective utility to human society. What the problem involves is there is a train, there are 5 people tied on the train. There are various versions of that, but this is the sum and the substance of this. And there is a train trolley that's kind of running freely, unhindered. And there is a strong, beefy guy on the other track. So what do? Do you allow the trolley to run over these 5 people and crush them and cause their heavenly demise? Or do you push this strong guy in the way, killing him, of course, but sparing the lives of those 5? Is there a definitive solution to this conundrum? I don't know. It depends upon your orientation about your value judgments. What's more interesting from the perspective of our current discussion is that they ran this test as a controlled trial with placebo and with people who were administered oxytocin. So, and they had 2 versions of this. All 3 were nameless people. All the people were nameless. And there was virtually no difference in the control group and the people who were administered oxytocin. The next time, they anointed people with descriptors of names that invoked cultural affiliations and feelings of xenophobia and hatred and the divisiveness, the fundamental dichotomy of us versus them. So they named if that big beefy guy was named Dirk, which is a common name in Netherlands, or if he was named Otto, which is a German name kind of inciting the World War II hatred between the 2 lands, or Mahmoud, possibly capturing the slight reservation people have about Islamic fanaticism. It turns out that people with oxytocin were less inclined to push Dirk onto the track to save the lives of 5 because it invoked an affiliation with people who were remarkably like them. And they were far more trigger happy to really disdainfully and indifferently push Otto or Mahmoud onto that. So this kind of really allows you to think, is it really a case of considered judgment about us entertaining a set of choices clinically and making our judgments and enacting out our inclinations accordingly, according to a certain grand design, or even in deference to these exalted concepts of humanism, of morality, of virtues? Or are we condemned to be swayed by these subterranean forces who will forever constrain and confine our behaviors? So empathy is something that people believe is distinctively human. And I believe this video is an antidote to the dismal picture all those collective titles may have painted about primates and how they are preternaturally inclined towards violence and perpetrating violence.
Dat is waar school hebben. Even kijken of ze het wil. Nee?
Ook 57.
Mama.
Druifjes. Dat is het vorige. Ja, vrouwtje, ja. Ja, je bent braaf, je bent braaf. Jo.
Echt maar.
Jo. Nee, een druifje. Ja. Hoezo? Ja. Hè? Mama? Ja. Ja. Heb je dat kloppen? Ja. Ga maar lekker liggen. Jo. Ze wil me helemaal bij zich hebben. Jo.
Maar je kunt gewoon zien dat ze nog echt goed bij is. Maar ik heb wel echt hele mooie shots.
Oké, prachtig.
Ja, anders heb ik ook nog wat.
Ja.
Heel mooi.
Ja.
Kom snel overeind.
Nou, kom zo overeind. Nee,
Laat ze nou
het
lekker.
gaat liggen.
Genoeg energie gekost misschien.
So that's Mama, the chimp, who had prepared herself to die, and she died soon after. So as soon as she recognized the person who had cared for her, there was a distinctive change in her response. And if that was not empathetic, if that was not concern and care and affection, I don't know what is. So this conception of empathy being limited, this conception of, we choose to define it humanism, but I believe that fundamental inclination to be kind is pervasive across the species in different expressions, of course, but you cannot simply rule out the possibilities of its existence. So it depends upon how it's moderated by interpersonal relations and circumstances and contexts. Contexts also of biology. Maybe frailty does that to you, really. It kind of really brings to the foreground the finer emotions. You could be drunk with the arrogance of your strength and power, and you could behave very otherwise, which is why, power, they say power corrupts. But there is another take on power. When you can behave in an unconstrained way with the assurance that you have the full freedom to do that, or maybe there are no social constraints limiting you, you kind of really act in your true nature. So power corrupts, but it also exposes your true nature. So we looked at one dimension of the primate origins. We looked at the biological factors that militate against realizing humanism so easily. It's not simply a concept of embracing the wider concept and kind of enacting out the promises of a more humane world. I think the other possibility is what really happens. So if you look at this famous book by Richard Dawkins, he's at Oxford, and Richard Dawkins has written a very phenomenally popular book called The Selfish Gene. The idea is that we are forever in the thrall of the powers of the gene, which acts out its selfish impulse, using us, or for that matter, any organism, simply as a tool for its purposes purposes of its own perpetuation. And this theory has a very strong, a very strong root in the entire world of biological thinking as well. So, and you've got to, we were having this conversation with Sanjeev ji yesterday, how a particular thought really acquires the mental space and imagery of a particular group of people, or in fact, a wide group of people in a particular moment in time. So this idea was also kept. So the reason for popularity of this book was that this was also, this conception of selfishness, of greed being good, was also held afloat by the wider political and social currents of the times. It was the time of Thatcher and Reagan as well, and Thatcher is renowned for the infamous comment of greed being good. So it's all kind of really prevalent currents from different disciplines and different social expressions coming together to create a groundswell of a particular dominant thought process, a particular paradigm. But it turns out that even Dawkins, not simply as an act, wistful act of having your cake and eating it too, also maintains that we humans have the consciousness, the conscious capacity, and the sense of agency to override the power, the deterministic power that genes have over us. We can do that through deliberation, through contemplative practices, which has long been a human tradition and a humanistic tradition. And there is another strand of thought in biology, again of equally eminent repute, that maintains that there is something to altruism. Does it serve an evolutionary purpose as well? And altruism is incidentally what will underpin a sense of humanity if we care to reflect deep enough. So what he is insisting is, what they are insisting is that inclusive fitness, for the uninitiated, what it means from the world of biology is that people are more likely to sacrifice for people who are like them. And there is enormous humanism at display for that moment among people in Israel, among people in Palestine for each other, but a stark hostility for the other. So if I kind of really draw a parallel from the world of evolutionary biology, there is a tendency explained even on the grounds of the selfish precepts, the selfish world, that we are biologically inclined to be cooperative and to be kind to people who are like us, with the underlying intent that it would help perpetuate the shared genes that we share with people who are like us. So even Dawkins has said that. But what Novak, the person who's written, Novak and Highfield, who've written this wonderful book called The Super Cooperators, what they're saying is that, of course, yes, natural selection, genetic mutations, they've been prime drivers of change and evolution. But there's something about cooperation as well, which is a major architect of all the remarkable changes you see writ large, from genes to societies to cultures as well. And what they're saying is that there is some merit in that level of cooperation. They're saying that group selection really works. What they're saying is that sense of reciprocal altruism really also helps in advancing the cause. What they're saying is indirect altruism underpins the realization of complex societies. So if we really if we are cooperative only to a very limited band of people, the size of our collective edifice is rather limited, precisely because of the nature of the interaction. But if you kind of really spread your kindness a little wider, not in direct reciprocality, for that matter, if I'm kind to you and you're kind to him in turn, it creates a cultural context. It creates a moral climate for this label, for this human enterprise to flourish beyond a certain limited size. And that's what's allowed us to realize these complicated societies and organizations as well. It's also, what they're saying is that language, cognition, and humanity and morality are evolutionary spin-offs of the need of social beings to cooperate, and not the other way around. So they're kind of really pitching the causal chain almost in the other direction. It's almost as if you need to really cooperate. So the evolution of biological processes came up with these involved versions of language, cognition, and also morality, because at a certain point in time, when we are simply not acting in a transactional manner, our choices are governed by a very strong sense of social conscience, underpinned by a certain commonly shared moral understanding. The other reason, we've explored the biological reasons for why we behave the way we do. There is an eminent piece of literature coming out from the world of neurobiology, of neurology, of neural sciences. And this, when I was walking up yesterday to your chamber, sir, I saw Newton School of Engineering, and I wondered, with Rishihood as the overarching ethos, I'm sure this university is not culpable of Newton's error, which the artist William Blake wanted to really capture in this image. This is a wonderful image. Newton, the doyen of physical sciences, of physics as well, to those of us who have science background. And we have nothing against it. In his times, he was far ahead of his time. But Newton, in this image, is intended to capture a monomaniacal mindset that limits itself to a one particular pursuit, to a pursuit from the blinkered vision of one discipline. So, which is what he said. Newton, if you see in this image, is right at the bottom of the ocean. But he's enraptured, he's lost in his thought processes. What he's doing is he's kind of really drawing a circle, mathematically precise, and involved as well. And the idea, the intent of Newton's pursuit is that he's trying to unravel the layers of reality, of creation. But there is an irony to this imagery. Newton is ensconced in the creation itself, and yet he's oblivious of it, because he's really so caught up by his slightly parochial pursuit. So that's why he said, he wrote William Blake, who was quite a visionary in his times, not as celebrated, but history is far more kind to visionaries than their current times are. So he said that this picture captures single vision and Newton's asleep. And why that might be pertinent to our discussion for humanism is what we need to unravel. So, and again, if you really look at these, even from the world of policy and social sciences, Adam Smith is renowned for his work in economics. The Wealth of the Nations is his celebrated treatise, but he wrote the theory of moral sentiments far before he came up with the Wealth of the Nations. And he talks about humans being delusional, of humans being delusional, and how the inclination or the fact that we are self-delusional can really compromise our tendencies towards humanism really needs to be seen. So the question, what's mentioned there is the self-deceit that's so pervasive in mankind really does not allow us to see things as they are. Because we are governed, as we saw, we are governed by our biologies. In the case of that runaway trolley experiment, we are governed by our thought processes. We are governed by the limitations of our mental canvas. We see realities, but very partial, distorted views of realities. So this means that the sense of conscience, not incidental, but formative and constitutive to our morality, the sense of the person, as they say, the term that they use is the man within the breast is what they use. The person, our conscience, that kind of really presides over our moral judgments. It kind of really, it can be diluted into delivering a very false report because of the veil of delusion we all carry within us. And this has implications. And as the acclaimed neurologist and psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist, and he's written a number of books. He's written a book about the divided brain. He's written a book about the matter of things. And what he's suggesting is that humans have to, or for that matter, every living being has two fundamental needs: to provide for itself, to find food. And we are talking about primordial needs: to find food and to prevent from becoming a food for someone else. The first one requires that you bring a very focused sense of attention in your pursuits in this world as you navigate the world, to pin down, to grasp things. The second one requires a very sustained, diffused sense of attention. And what he's suggesting is that 700 million years of neural networks are rather asymmetrical. And even in humans, the neural networks are organized asymmetrically in two hemispheres and with different levels of primacy that they have. So what he's saying is that the problems that we find, the lack of morality, the lack of empathy, the lack of humanism, if you will, in our societies are also because of our dominant worldviews that we bring. The worldviews of reductionist reductionism, of materialism, that the left brain dictates, creates for a certain sense of urgency about material pursuits, a certain sense of unequivocal judgments, a certain sense of self-conviction, which may not be really well-founded at times. Whereas the right brain brings a very diffuse, sustained sense of attention. It's much more receptive. It's much more receptive to the ideas. It's much more open. It's much more integrative. And we need the collaboration across these two hemispheres for a realistic depiction of reality, as it were. So the right brain is one that really apprehends reality. The left brain then pronounces judgment. It parcels out, it dissects. That's the nature of the academic enterprise. We probe deeper and deeper into different disciplines, really. And we create a narrative. We create a logical flow, cause and effect. And then the left brain needs to really submit its findings and its analysis to the right brain again for a more empowering view of reality, something that's more encompassing, something that's more realistic. This is why, what they've wondered is we've seen one line of thought processes which seem to really suggest that our biology condemns us not to be human in its more dispersed conception. But then there is another school of thought which is suggesting that why our brains are also wired to connect, really. What are the reasons? And what if the right brain thinking really gains some primacy? We could find connections somewhere. And the problem is, if we see the left brain thinking as it really rules the roost, it creates the fertile ground for its own flourishing as well. So you find that in academia, you find that in civil services as well, sir. So as we'll see in and the question is, it also really suggests what we are open to receive, and if we are really so focused with a particular mindset, and we see what we are inclined to see. And as they say, the limit of my language, I think it was Ludwig Wittgenstein, the limits of my language defines the limits of my world. So, and language, again, is the preserve of the left brain. So the right brain is more inclined towards the word of Sampadananji. It's kind of really, it comprehends profundity. But that level of profundity, especially if it's so far removed from the common experience of the masses, is very difficult to kind of encapsulate and express in words. So the exposition of its own understanding is a limitation for the right brain. So here's another example of how we'll only see what we are inclined to see. How our blinker visions really divorces us from our reality.
I'm Dan Simons. I'm a professor in the psychology department at the University of Illinois, and I also have an appointment at the Beckman Institute for Advanced Science and Technology. My research here focuses on visual cognition, what we see, what we don't see, how much of our visual world we're aware of, how much we remember from one moment to the next. One of my best-known studies was done with my collaborator Chris Chabris some years ago, and it was based on some much earlier work by our colleague Dick Neisser. And what we had was a video in which people were passing basketballs. So 3 people were wearing white shirts and they were passing a ball. And your task when you were watching the video was just to count how many times those 3 players passed the ball. We also had 3 players wearing black shirts passing their own ball, and you were supposed to ignore their passes. So as you're doing this task, after about 30 seconds, say, we'd have a person wearing a full-body gorilla suit walk into the middle of the scene, stop in the center, turn and face the camera, thump its chest, and then walk off the other side a total of about 9 seconds later. And what we find is that about half the people who do this simply don't notice the gorilla.
When Dan asked me to be a part of this experiment, I thought, no way, people are totally going to see me. I'm a 400-pound gorilla.
We'll ask them afterwards, how many passes did you count, which they generally get pretty close to right. We then ask them, did you notice anything unusual? Did you notice anything other than the players? Did you notice anything walk through the scene? And they'll say no. So we ask them, did you notice a gorilla? And the response is typically, a what?
So then the Simons guy says, we can show you and not everyone's going to see you? Yeah, right. How can people not see me? I'm huge. I'm ferocious. I'm a 400-pound gorilla. What was he thinking?
And we rewind the tape and show it to them again, and the reaction is typically, I missed that? It's shocking that you could possibly miss something as obvious as a gorilla. Of course, the people who noticed the gorilla are shocked that anybody could possibly have missed it. because it's right there in front of you.
I walk in there, I walk in the middle, all these kids are running around throwing this ball around. I stand there, I thump my chest. Not once, not twice, 3 times I thump my chest. That's scary, man. What else are people gonna look at? You know, I'm big, I'm a gorilla, and they don't see me. What's up with that?
This is the intuition we have, that if something important or distinctive or unusual, like a person in a gorilla suit, walks into our field of view, we'll automatically notice it. The reality is that only about half the people do. About 90% think they will.
People are just so focused on counting those passes that they don't notice me. You know, I'm not trying to be subtle here.
Even more remarkable, my colleague Daniel Memmert used the gorilla video in a study in which he had people wearing an eye tracker. And what that does is tells you exactly where they're looking as they're watching this video and counting the passes by the team wearing white. And what he found was that the people who missed the gorilla looked at it for up to a second. So they looked right at it, but still didn't see it. Looking isn't the same as seeing. We have to focus attention on something in order to become aware of it.
How do you think it makes me feel? You know, I'm trying to be intimidating. It makes me feel inadequate.
The most consistent question we get is, are there some people who consistently notice the gorilla and other people who don't? So are there noticers and missers among us? And the reality seems to be no, that it's largely just a matter of a flip of the coin. We know when we've noticed something unexpected, but we're not aware of the times when we've missed something unexpected. The failure to notice people in gorilla suits is really a natural byproduct of something that we do quite well and that's very important to us, which is focusing our attention. We need to be able to filter out the distractions from our world and not let them interfere with our ability to do the task we're trying to do. The key is that when you're focusing your attention on one aspect of your world, you don't have an unlimited amount of attention to devote to other things. And we only see those things that we focus our attention on. The problem is that on occasion we filter something that we might want to notice, and we don't realize that we're doing that. That sort of mismatch between what we see and what we think we see is a really profound one that has all sorts of consequences for our daily lives.
Okay, I admit it. I didn't see me either.
The significance of this experiment was that if something is not a part of your mental template, pre-existing mental template, it'll never, never have any salience for you. You will not defer to its dictates, you will not notice that, you will not honor that. So humanism, in a world that's kind of really dominated by the mainstream intellectual traditions of the day, is something that simply doesn't figure in their calculus. Or it's something that is not captured by the dominant way of thinking, which is largely left brain, analytical, linguistically oriented as well. So if something is not brought to the foreground of our consciousness, it's not going to really clamor for our attention, at least of all find realization in our everyday individual and collective expressions. So this is a famous author, and she used to write about very upbeat, and she's a very profound writer as well. And she writes about hope as well. And as she's really grown slightly older, there's been a somber tone to her exposition. And she was asked that, why are you becoming a cynic as time wears on? And she said, well, the art of living for a 41-year-old is a lot different than for a 21-year-old. And it's not simply that. What she says is that citizenship, the act of living in a human society, teaches you that there's no perfectibility in human affairs. So that's a word of caution. This is something that would interest Sanjeev ji from a public policy perspective as well, Tocqueville's two dystopias. And Tocqueville talks about the bad and the very bad. The bad is the current state, and Sir, being a bureaucrat, will kind of really lend his approval or not, possibly, if he has a different take to that. So bureaucratic corridors have a way of perpetuating not only their influence, their power, and they replicate the mechanisms of their decisions quite dramatically. and that force can multiply quite rapidly and be pervasive. So that's what he said. What really happens is, in the bad conception of state, it's a state of equality of subjugation. The equality of subjugation means you are held hostage to an elaborate sense of rules, where what he insists, what he asserts rather pejoratively, which means slightly borderline insultingly, he says that the state makes all the detailed rules and relieves you of the burden of living, where it kind of really, you are stunted and in a state of immaturity, like a childlike immaturity, where the state is governing all your actions through an elaborate sense of rules. It doesn't tyrannize. It doesn't tyrannize. It's, of course, I mean, it's meant to really assert in certain clinical outcomes for our collective humanity. But what it does is, it does not allow to be born. It doesn't destroy. It doesn't allow the novel to be born. So it desiccates, it enervates, it robs, it stupefies. And it kind of really does not allow you that sense of agency, which even there are some writers of repute who insist that barbaric societies are far more creative, because each person has an agency, each person is a warrior, each person is a statesman. Whereas this kind of elaborate division of labor kind of stunts the full expression of your potentiality. Then there's, of course, the very bad, when the kind of really the specter of violence that we witness across the long arc of humanity, which is when the equality of subjection has disappeared, but a despotic faction really takes over, and then all the hell breaks loose when we are not constrained by any law or institutions that enforce law. So the sense of justice that we were really wondering about in Tocqueville's conception of dystopias, again, I mean, we talk about humanism, we talk about what is right and wrong, we talk about moral conceptions, because in the end, humanism has a very abiding arch of morality that kind of really overhangs over its discussions and deliberations. So is, again, the conception of justice novel only to humans, or is it something that has deeper creative urges?
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So what he says is this is basically the Wall Street problem. And as you can say, I mean, we accord to ourselves that level of primacy, but you see that sense of conception. And this is not a trained response, as he started with a disclaimer. This says new monkeys given the task still having that conception. Now, he said it's kind of correlates with the prices of the supermarket, not quite, but possibly. Possibly the energetic potential of the food, the caloric potential of the food is something that species are inclined to respond to. And which is why, I mean, I'm reminded of, there was this discussion happening yesterday about essences and things. So Martin Heidegger kind of really railed against the entire conception of human being, humanism. He said that, and he's an eminent philosopher, German philosopher, and he said any conception of humanism, whether it's Hellenic or whether it's Roman or it's Marxist, is inherently limited. He says it accords primacy to humans, and it kind of really legitimizes the subjugation of society by technology. He wrote a book, Das Gestell, and possibly also kind of enforcing the supremacy of humans over other non-human animals and even the inanimate world as it is. And our conception really doesn't really believe anything is inanimate, and neither does quantum physics. It kind of everything is vibrant and alive, just if you probe a little deeper. So we're talking about economics because that's the theater of the dominant flavor of our times, the dominant paradigm, the world of commerce. And so you've been you've held very luminary posts in those departments as well. And this is where our collective enterprise is most visibly realized. So the most potent vehicle, as it were, of human collaboration and human ingenuity. Brian Arthur, I think he's a Nobel laureate as well, and he's done some work in complexity theory. And he has a very important take about this. And he says the standard economic theory and the fallacies it perpetuates sometimes, and the partial truths is guilty of at other times, is precisely because of the language it deploys, precisely because of its overarching mode of thinking. So what it's saying is, in its pursuit to be theoretically elegant, it is guilty of doing away with all the vitality which underpins economic affairs. What it is saying is, in its attempt to create a very neat theoretical framework, it's only limiting itself to the use of nouns. So price, quantities, labels. So of allocation, of say rates of interest, rates of exchange rates, GDP, singular numbers that can supposedly capture the composite vibrance of economy with limited realistic representation. So he also went on to look at, he invokes the idea of Robert Solow, who I think in 1951 or something, he wondered about what accounts for major economic developments. And he said the increases in labor and capital is responsible only for explaining the 20% of economic growth. While the rest of 80%, he put in that slightly obscure and impenetrable idea of technology. Now, it's kind of really makes one wonder if our economic models don't quite explain the 80% of economic growth, then they are not very faithful representations of reality. So how do you really ensure, and for that matter, economics deals with two problems of allocation, questions of allocations, and questions of realization, questions of activity. So economies develop, market and institutions form, economic structures are transformed, structural transformation happens. So what really happens if our entire apparatus, theoretical apparatus, is completely indifferent to the vibrance underlying economy? And what damage does it wreak, really? And it's kind of, his take is corroborated with the psychiatrist Mr. McGilchrist's view that whatever remains implicit or can't be brought into focus ceases to exist. So we are faithfully oblivious to whatever we cannot really put in the neat theoretical categories and carry on regardless. And which is why there was this wonderful episode actually happened. So there was this conference in London School of Economics, and when Queen Victoria turned around to this array of very eminent economists and very politely asked, after the 2007-8 economic crisis, did you guys not see this coming? It's not get the right answer. No, nobody. And with economists, possibly, I mean, yes. There was the array of economists, really, they never speak in one unified voices, really. And ex ante, it's very difficult to kind of really pin your faith in one singular voice, really one isolated individual. So this is kind of really, it makes one wonder. And the same thing, as I said, I started off by saying that most of the finance which was taught to us in Oxford was from a psychological lens. We never really engaged in neat mathematical problems of how teaching can be done in other quarters. When theory is laid out, you do certain clinical analysis and you come out with perfect definitive answers. Lo and behold, your understanding is complete and unequivocal and definitive. So there was an elaborate attempt to really understand human frailties and foibles, which were responsible also for economic crisis and invariably are, and how you could really design mechanisms and policies to rule out those unfortunate outcomes from being realized, much to their collective distress. So what they've done is they've looked at utility. Now, that's a very awkward and poorly defined concept of utility, which is used in economics. So they'll kind of really start with that common example of what happens if you eat two chapatis. You have a certain level of utility. The fourth one will have a little slightly lesser utility. Whatever that means and plays out on the ladder of human physiology is largely unexplained. So what they are attempting to do is they are broadening the ambit of the economic policy, economic theoretical models to incorporate certain dimensions of humanism. And what they are saying is that their needs, identities, motives, and there is a literature of repute from Daniel Kahneman in behavioral economics as well that defers to human constraints, psychological constraints that dictate and creep into human decision making. We are no longer rational decision makers. There are no optimal decisions to be made and perfect policies to be realized. So what they say is what matters really. So we are not just simply wealth maximizing individuals. We also trade off across identities. There is an arbitrage not only across goods and services. There's an arbitrage across prospective identities of humans, the identities you and I carry of us. So one particular identity, if it's more empowering, and to the extent our baser needs are provided, we are more inclined to gravitate towards a choice that allows us to realize a slightly more refined sense of identity. And herein might lie the missing pyramid, the missing ladder of Maslow's pyramid of human needs. I think it stops at self-actualization. Some people are suggesting that if we kind of really factor in unpublished literature, he had a final ladder as well at the apex of the pyramid, and that's self-transcendence. And that's what essentially humanism would involve, and that's what philosophical pursuits and spiritual exercises and spiritual evolution is largely claimed to help realize. So, and they involve what kind of warm glows, they kind of reciprocal altruism, which means if you're kind to me and I'm more inclined to be kind to you, as we saw in that video of Mama, the chimpanzee with that earlier caretaker. It works across a species, so there are chances that it would certainly work in species. And there is something known as warm glow. Charity, how doing good to others really helps my emotional well-being and dictates my choices. So all those factors are increasingly sought to be incorporated in our economic valuations as well. So the rather dispiriting, the rather disempowering image of Homo economicus as being governed by the clinical pursuit of his limited wealth is being broadened. Its ambit is being stretched to incorporate ideas of humanism and how humans can certainly behave. So again, I mean, and this is slight change in our economic dispensation is also finding reflection in the world of business as well. So there are organizations that factor in, that reward, that recognize businesses who are attempting to realize values and virtues much beyond the purely financial numbers. You can call it blended value, you can call it impact investing, you can call it, the ESG is somewhat limited, environmental and social goals. And policy also steps in to kind of really force businesses to realize that they are not isolated islands unto themselves, but they are nested in wider society. And to the extent they cannot really provide for the well-being of the collective whole, they are not really serving the purpose they really ought to. The first quotation we said that man is, from Hazlitt, who said that man is the only person who weeps and laughs because he's really torn by the predicament of how things ought to be and how things really are. So, and Mo Ibrahim, I was kind of really sharing the discussion with Sanjeevji and some bunch of other luminaries as well. These are the advances. People are increasingly, so beyond a certain point in time, people are realizing that wealth really does not really satisfy them. They have moved on to that ladder of realization. So they want to really reach out beyond their petty, they want to widen the circle of their compassion, beyond immediate kin, whose validity and veracity is recognized even in other species, to kind of really embrace a larger number of people, to kind of cast out my nest of compassion a little wider. So impact investing, again, is a very concerted attempt. I've been a part of a few exercises as well, where people, now this is not the passivity that Sampadananji talks about in All Pursuits. So this is not simply a passive deference to certain goals dictated by policymakers, but this is an active attempt on the part of actors who have a sense of agency, who want to really do good. So they actively seek out investment opportunities and they help execute projects which create a lot of social good. So again, as we come back to the technology aspect for want of space, Neelab had highlighted, and Sanjeevji had been kind of really pinning me down. We are in the brave new world, really, of artificial general intelligence, of really, if you call the potent powers of technology really subsuming all our endeavors. And it kind of really invokes imagery both of immense empowerment, as we really increasingly find, much to our wonder and rapturous attention, the things that it can help accomplish instrumentally as well. But there is an equally strident note of dystopia, where people are wondering what would happen if possibly, with increasing level of competence, will technology be remarkably alike to humans? Will it even have consciousness itself? And what this post-human or transhuman world really involves and entails? Where will it take us? What if they kind of really, and to kind of really invoke the horrific imagery from some Hollywood images, what if we are kind of really subjugated by conscious machines who are far more intelligent than us? So that's exactly, again, this is something that those discussions are rife amongst all relevant peoples, and attempts are underway to ensure that human agency is not something that we surrender, that we actively moderate and modulate our choices as to how we develop and deploy our technologies. And of course, I mean, again, the dominant flavor of the times will dictate the outcomes, as it's so often done along the arc of history. So how we really deploy our resources, our investments, our time and energies, and how the various institutions and also the public institutions really come into the equation will determine a lot of things. So incidentally, ChatGPT is something that's kind of captured our attention collectively. And Sam Altman, the progenitor of that technology, is kind of repeatedly insists ad nauseum, kind of regulate. And he himself is not sure as to what the direction this will take. Because emergence, again, we were talking about this concept, emergence has a potency of its power far beyond the human power to comprehend ahead of its time. What will be the outcome of all these variables really intersecting with each other, acting in unison? It's very difficult to hazard a conjecture, very difficult to countenance the possibility with a certain level of definitiveness as to what is the level of world that would ensue and materialize. So this is, again, I mean, she heads the AI and AI department in MIT, and they've been really running a lot of conferences in an active attempt to harness the power of AI for our collective good, and to ensure that the dystopia remains at bay forever, hopefully. And humanistic AI, so Pablo Picasso, is a person no less, wondered many years ago about the utter uselessness of computers. And why you find that image of migraine AI occluding this is precisely because of how wrong he's been proved, how wrong a genius has been proved with the passage of time. So these are, and the question is how really, if you really look at the world of businesses, and if you look at these major technological players, or for that matter, any organization, how it realizes its ambitions is that it creates plans are set in motion by the people at the top, the leadership, if you will. And they are then filtered down the ladder of hierarchy, and then people sit down to really codify the objectives into various remuneration packages, whether technological exercises. And those objective functions, you know, the variables, the drivers of those objective functions find expression in how an organization pursues its activities. So the idea is if we can really hack the objective function itself, not from capturing human attention, for the good of filling a few private coffers, but for delivering wider good. Possibly there's some opportunity there, a thoughtful intervention right at the level of how we design the objective function of these exercises. So if you look at that migraine AI, to those who've had the unfortunate experience of either themselves having experienced that or having had a near and dear one be under the seas of this, realize that it's so difficult to predict. And it's largely what the mainstream medical science terms as idiopathic, pathology not known, hitherto. But it seems that the virtues of latest advances, so what it does is, there are wearable devices really that capture your biological data over a continuous period of time. And those slight perturbations are really picked up, which are so very difficult, because if you go to your to your physician after the event, the markers have subsided, and he doesn't have any corroborating evidence of kind of pinning down the causal chain as to what caused and what incited your migraine headache. But it turns out that the skin color is a very good predictor of the onset of migraine. So what they've done is they capture continuous data, and what they look at the volumetric flow of blood to your peripheral areas, they kind of capture the skin color over a longitudinal period of time, and changes in that skin color really can predict migraine and allow you to really take interventions ahead of the time and relieving you of much misery. And what they did was a classic business pivot as well, when kind of COVID completely besieged our collective humanity. They kind of deployed the same AI algorithms, the same technologies to kind of test, if not really testing, but kind of forecasting your likelihood of having a COVID. Because it turned out during that time, 40% of infection was being spread by people who were untested. So if you had a prior intimation of the likelihood of where you were before the biological assay test, you could take those measures, and people around you could take those measures. And again, the same things, they tested your heart rate variability, they looked at the pattern of your cough sounds really, and they could really pin down with remarkable efficacy. Cognition, again, I mean, in the world of, so if people have a stroke, they lose their power of speech. They lose their power of speech. I've had a very painful experience, and we've had recently a tragedy in our family when I lost my dear uncle, and that explains my tonsured head as well. And he disappeared gradually over a period of time, over 1.5 years, to advanced Parkinson's. And he was somebody who was so full of life, so expressive, and he gradually, and in fact, rather rapidly at that, lost his complete mental faculty, because it turns out your power of speech is remarkably driven by your mental neurocircuitry. So while the underlying neural circuitry might be impenetrable, the causality is the direct causality between your neural compromise and deficit and the power of speech is very palpable, it's very definitive, and it's very painful. And when that happens is, what's the recourse? I mean, it's enormously frustrating for a person who was remarkably expressive to be constrained by this burden of wanting to engage with people, wanting to express, and yet not being able to. Kind of, it's a bit like really tying up your face, really, and not being able to breathe. I'm sure the experience is remarkably as vivid as that. So what they've done is augmented and artificial communication is a branch of research. It kind of draws upon advances in artificial reality and certain proprietary algorithms and tracking cameras. So what they do is they can track where your eye are looking at, and then can really pin down as to what is the word that you're looking at. So eyes almost act as a proxy for speaking. And that's so really remarkable as well. And they've kind of really spread that a little further. They refined the technology, an example of singularity certainly, to a level where your visual field is overlaid by words. And if your mind wants to really pin down a particular word, your brain signal registers that change. And electroencephalogram will really pick out those signals and correlate and weave a narrative as to what you want to speak. So there's a famous professor, Migueli, I reckon, who could speak 9 voices and had a stroke. Lorenzo Migueli, if I'm not mistaken. And a person who could speak, who was a polyglot, 9 languages, and suddenly he could not speak. And a person of very fertile brain and very fecund thought processes, and reduced to a vegetable. From a distance, of course, the mental processes are all bubbling underneath with the same level of vigor and rigor. And he was the first one to test, among the first few to test this pilot of cognition. And he said he was so full of gratitude. And he said, great science, great technological advances are both a science and an art. And it requires and it's a province of art to incorporate great imagination into a science's pursuits. And he said it requires enormous empathy to identify, to feel other person's pain as your own, empathy or humanism by any other name. And he said if you can inhabit a different person's pain, you can realize with a sense of empathy his emotions, and that could be a tribute to your own refinement. So another one of these things of technological advances of transformative technologies, just watch closely. It's a short video, just see what happens. Watch for the facial expressions of the dyads.
The same love and gratitude that we have for our own heart. Next, on the count of 3, we will lower the heart into our laps and raise our eyes to look into our partner's right eye. Siguiendo, vamos a ver directamente a los ojos de nuestro pareja. 1, 2, 3. Listening to our partner's heart, holding the light of their heart, and looking into their right eye. Can we remain open and vulnerable, even as our patterns, our training, is to shield?
So watch what happened there. If you did not pick that up. So this is not voodoo or some new age attempt to spread lovey-dovey feelings all around. They were kind of really holding in their hands respective globes. And that was really capturing the heartbeat of the other person. The moment they could sense the heartbeat of the other person, they were enlivened, they were enraptured by the possibility of wanting to make a connection. It's almost as if they were inhabiting the other person's fullness, through a technological means to realize almost a humanistic, empathetic connection to the other. So what might take, Sampadananji might not forgive me for this, spiritual sadhana, this is an attempt, could be misguided in some ways, but not entirely without its merit, an attempt to realize the fruits of protracted sadhana towards which not all of us may be inclined or disposed or capable enough. And maybe if not capturing the full profundity, the full majesty of sadhana practices, at least a small sliver, a glimpse into what it would involve, and possibly a prod to move you in that direction. So Erich Fromm, again, he believes that humanity really lies. He's one of the great German humanists as well. So he's always been firmly erred in the side of insisting that human connections are the fundamental requirement of humans. So quite unlike the Freudian insistence of men being petty, isolated, selfish, and governed simply by the pleasure principles. Again, Jean-Jacques Maritain is a Thomas thinker as well, again, a great humanist as well. So he kind of really exhorts you to find your creative forces and the life of reason. What we really explored in the work of Ian McGilchrist, the divided brain of the creative tendencies and propensities of the right brain and the analytical rigor of the left, and how the two really need to really not work at cross purposes but act in unison. The right one apprehending reality in its fullness, not the blinkered, partial, skewed worldview, submitting it off to the left one for its own rigorous analysis, and then again a reverse movement back into that for a much more enriched worldview. If you see, the divided brain hints at the battle of the arbiters of modern scientific world, really, of parceling it out into ever smaller packages for better penetrative analysis. And then the more creative instinct of integrating the partial truths of those deep analysis. And I'm sure this is my thought process as well. I do believe that single stories can never really capture the richness, the reality of the truth out there, as it were. So if we see the truth as a landscape and the theoretical models as the painting, the language of expression and the various tools we deploy are the palette that we use. And what we see, what we are able to capture from the reality out there to our theoretical conceptions is dictated by the palette we are using, the kind of tools we are using, the wider array of tools that we are deploying. So no discussion of humanism would be complete without the mention of the famous sociobiologist E.O. Wilson, who said that we need to really move towards consilience. We really need to move towards synthesizing different knowledge streams for a more enriched and enhanced understanding of what really is. Not as a patchwork, not as a collage, but a more interpenetrating analysis where they collectively create a more edifying version of not only our pursuit, but also of the reality that we are seeking to unpack and unravel. So before I end my exposition, in the spirit of intellectual honesty, I've attributed the ideas to its original progenitors. I also need to acknowledge the wonderful help my dear friend's daughter, Navni Aras, lent me in putting this together. And over the past few years of interaction, through her endearing ways, with an appropriate blend, a beguiling mix of maturity and innocence, she's given me that peek into the blessed world of her daughter's affection. And this is certainly where the seeds of compassion lie. The challenge are to really widen the ambit of this embrace into the wider world out there. Thank you so much.